This is Jeannie Shear, Purple Loosestrife Biocontrol Coordinator with UW-Madison Division of Extension Natural Resources Institute's AIS program. Today we're going to take a look at digging and potting up your plants. We're going to start with what your final setup may look like. Not everyone is going to happen to have a lakeshore wetland with dead trees at the height needed to support the nets. The nets need to be supported so that they're standing tall, giving the purple loosestrife in them as much room to grow as possible. About 5 to 6 feet can be ideal. Your plants should be set up to get as much sun as possible also. And if you can avoid very windy locations, you'll be a step ahead. I've set my own plants up under my clothesline and tied the tops of the nets to it, but I live on a hill, and a couple of times I looked out and saw an entire plant, pot, net, and all had been lifted right out of the kiddie pool. So I mentioned that raising my plants at home, I've set them up under a clothesline, and that worked out fine. I've also have a shed that I tied one end of a rope to and the other end to a branch off a nearby tree and tied the tops of the plants to that rope, or the tops of the nets, of course. That worked out fine too. Sometimes you just got to be creative. Here, one of our partners used an old dog run. There was a metal pipe going across the top, and she tied the plants up to that. Here's another interesting structure that someone built to keep their nets nice and tall. Obviously, this one's made completely out of wood, and it's very similar to the ones behind the young men in the photo at the beginning of this video. This is the setup used at the Lake Mills DNR Wildlife Management Station. It was the first I helped with that wasn't in my own yard. Here they built a structure using small diameter pipes and support pieces, then added extra support by staking ropes. This was a great setup with abundant sunlight and moderate wind. Note that they used 5-gallon buckets for potting, and the nets were tightly secured with bungee cords. This is another really nice setup. They've used fence posts, but notice how they've extended each post to make them a little bit taller because they want to get those nets stretched up as tall as they can to give the plants as much room to grow as possible. The pools hold, I'd say, 6 to 8 pots each, so those are nice size pools. You can get away with smaller ones, you just put in fewer pots. The netting happens to be a gray netting. It's the same sort of thing that you'll see anybody else using with the white netting, but the gray nets have been out there for a while. Some people still have them that are okay. Someone may have a old roll of gray netting they're cutting from, and that's fine. The plants obviously are doing just fine with the gray instead of the white. Let's talk about digging your plants. You should get out to dig them so that they can be potted and have as much time to grow as possible before beetles are added for rearing. Your plants will need to be at least 18 inches tall to support the beetles at the time you add them. Often we'll get out to dig the plants when there's actually still snow on the ground. If the ground is thawed enough to shove in a pitchfork, you can start digging. This can be mid to late March in southern Wisconsin or as late as the first week in May in the north, but it'll depend on your weather in any given year. Not a lot of tools are needed. A pitchfork works great in wet or drier soils. A shovel will help for splitting the roots besides digging. The woody roots can be so large and tough that a handsaw can also be very helpful to have along. If the area is wet, knee-high boots or possibly waders will be important. Then don't forget something to haul the plants to the potting site. Tubs or a kiddie pool work great. Plastic bags are okay too, but the roots and any dry stems may poke through. And make sure you take along some water and a large brush to clean off your footwear and gear. This is a messy job, and we don't want to accidentally transport any purple loosestrife seeds or any other invasive species. Next, we'll take a look at how Brock Woods, the originator of the Wisconsin Purple Loosestrife Biocontrol program, dug his rootstock.
Okay, what you want to look for is a loosestrife clump that's got at least 6 good, healthy stems. And they're healthy if they have last year's pods on them. Some of the stems you see here are totally devoid of pods, like the one closer to you. Those are 2 years or 3 years ago. You want stems that were healthy last year. This is ideal. It's got 6 stems. I'm out in very shallow water, so you should be able to get this out in 3 minutes using a fork without cutting many of the roots off. First thing I'm going to do is take the old stems, break them off at a handy length so they don't poke me in the eye. Take the fork, just go around the plant. You might have to go around more than just once, especially if you run into a log down there that the plant is sitting on. Best to do this with gloves on. Those stems are pretty rough. They lignify late in the season, and they can be pretty tough on your hands. You go out and you pull out 10 of these guys. Use the old stem bases as a handle. Using your legs too. And here's your loosestrife.
When you're ready to pot your plants, you should have 5-gallon pots or buckets, a nutrient-rich potting soil or regular potting soil with fish emulsion or another fertilizer to add, a hose with good water access, and kiddie pools where you'll put the potted plants so that you can keep water around the base of the roots at all times. Since many of our volunteers are also gardeners, they may already have pots on hand that they've saved from planting shrubs or small trees. People often source them from local landscapers if you ask them about their used pots. It's rare anyone needs to go out and buy some. The 5-gallon size is generally ideal, but you can get by with slightly smaller or larger. It helps, though, to keep them close in size so the soil level in each pot is approximately the same as the others. I've also used buckets that either have the handles removed or just flipped up out of the way. The ridge on a typical paint bucket can help keep the nets in place when the bottom is secured below it. To secure the bottom of the nets, I prefer bungee cords pulled as tight as I can get them. Other people swear by long zip ties, double-sided Velcro, or tying tightly in place with rope. Although rope is the item most likely to loosen, and it can be hard to manage once it's wet and dried a few times. Duct tape might get you through the season, but if it comes off once the bottom of the net is wet and dirty, it's nearly impossible to replace. To hold the top of the nets closed, I prefer ponytail holders. They won't dry out and break like rubber bands and are easier to open and close again when you add beetles to the plants later. It's important that the pools never get so filled with water that the soil in pots is saturated to the top. The last step in the life cycle for the larva is to go down into the soil to pupate, so you want the water to remain about 2 inches below the top of the soil in each pot. To manage the water, drill a few large holes a couple inches down from the top of the pool so that the excess water can just drain out. You may need to unclog the holes occasionally. By the way, if you're concerned about mosquitoes, look for mosquito dunks, a donut-shaped product that is placed in the standing water to kill mosquito larvae that doesn't harm the beetles. Just break off a piece and add it right to the water in the pool. If you have mosquito issues in general, having a couple buckets of water with a piece of dunk in each is good control measures. Spraying for mosquitoes in your rearing area or even nearby because of the drift that can happen is very likely to impact beetle rearing success, since the products being used are sometimes not as species specific as manufacturers and pesticide companies may lead you to believe. Once you have your plants out of the ground, brush off the debris that's on the top of the root ball and knock off any loose soil. Someone recently told me that they ended up with a snake in their pot one year. That had to make some people jump with surprise. That mud around the roots can contain tiny frogs and turtles still in an overwintering state, and any number of insect eggs and larvae that could end up being predators of your beetles and their larvae. And of course, there will probably be purple loosestrife seeds and possibly other invasive species. Debris like old leaves should just be knocked off and then give the whole root ball a few bangs to get off as much of the soil as practical. At your potting site, you can keep the roots on a large tarp, put them in the kiddie pools or a tub so that you can catch any debris. You're going to want to bag that debris up and dispose of it so that you don't end up with purple loosestrife growing in areas where there's never been any before. But how much should you clean those roots? Brock Woods recommended keeping a lot of the soil they came with on the roots since it should be very nutrient rich and good for them. On the other hand, I once had purple loosestrife sharing the pots with wild parsnip because of where I dug the plants. I didn't know it was there until I had actually seen it start growing. So people do a range of root cleaning. I've left most of the soil sometimes and others gone to the extreme. The first couple times I raised beetles with some partners, and I'm talking about 75 plants, we cleaned those roots as much as we possibly could and used a really good potting soil. They grew into the biggest plants I've ever raised, and we had loads of beetles. You're also likely to need to break up the root balls either at your potting site or before you even leave your dig. As mentioned before, they can be large and very woody. They are incredibly tough plants, which is part of their success as an invasive species, so don't hesitate to hack at them at the shovel to split them up or to use a saw. Because you may end up with extra pots because of splitting them, it's kind of nice because you probably won't have to dig quite as many plants as you originally thought. Potting purple loosestrife is really like potting any other plant. You're going to put a couple of inches of soil into the bottom of the pot and then set in the roots. Then fill the area around the roots with soil. You're going to push it down well. You want to make sure you keep any big air pockets out of there. Then water and let that water and soil settle so that you can see if you need to add more dirt to the pot. And almost always you'll have to. Having the soil in there nice and snug around the roots will give them the opportunity for good nutrition, and like I said, it'll also prevent air pockets. Secure the net sleeves around the bottom of your pot and then set the whole thing in your kiddie pool. Close the top. You can use a ponytail holder like I mentioned or some other way that you feel will work for you. And then you want to go ahead and tie the top of that net to the rope or whatever you've got set up to hold that net nice and tall. Next thing you do is just add water to the pool up to the height of the drained holes and let the growing begin. As I've already mentioned, digging and potting your plants as soon as possible will give them the best chance to grow to the 18 inches or more that we need before you get your starter beetles. Some people even dig in the fall and overwinter plants, but we'll cover that another time. The next way to give your plants an edge is to get the nets on them right away. They will act like little greenhouses to help warm the soil and promote growth. If possible, having them near a white or light-colored wall that can reflect heat and light can also help. Just avoid too much shade. The photo on the left is pretty typical of people using the standard nets. The volunteers who set up the plants on the right went above and beyond to make sure their plants had a great start in Vilas County, where the cold can linger long into the spring. Others have actually made use of larger greenhouses when they have access to them. You can be successful with just the netting, but if you happen to have options to promote growth, it certainly won't hurt. If growth is slow, you can also add some fertilizer. These plants come out of wetland soils, which are very nutrient rich. So while you're watching those plants grow, remember you're going to keep the pools filled. You want the soil to stay muddy, except for that top 2 inches should not be saturated. And if your plants aren't actually growing like you would expect, you may need to add a little fertilizer. Remember again, nutrient-rich soils, these plants take up a lot of nutrients. Even if you're not seeing them grow quickly after you pot them, it could be the roots are growing fine. It just hasn't had a chance to start putting out green on top. But again, if it seems really slow, and gardeners, you'll have a feel for this, go ahead and give a little fertilizer. Once the plant has reached 12 to 15 inches tall, Get in there with your scissors. You're going to take a look at the stems at the very top, pull back the top 2 leaves, and then clip off the little tip that you find hidden under them. That's going to promote bushiness and give you a lot more beetle and larval food. Now you're going back to watching. You're watching for those plants to get close to 18 inches. These plants happen to be in a mass rearing cage and not individually netted, but I use the photos so you can easily see the plants that are big enough for beetles to be added. If someone is collecting beetles for you, get in touch with them to arrange a time to get some as soon as your plants are at least 18 inches tall. It will be fine if the plants get bigger while you wait. Our goal is to get the beetles onto the plants just before or while they're still mating. If we wait too long, you may get beetles that are no longer laying eggs. An average of 10 beetles are added per plant. If you have some plants that are lagging behind others, though, it's okay to give them a couple less, but the odds of one or more of them laying eggs will, of course, be reduced. The time from adding beetles to your nets to the time new beetles emerge for release can vary from 4 to 6 weeks. Your beetles will likely lay their eggs quickly once they're added to your plants. That will be the end of the parent beetle's life cycle. In 2 to 3 weeks, the eggs will hatch and you will start seeing damage from the tiny larvae. It will get easier to see them as they grow through 5 stages called instars. Their feeding damage will make the leaves brown, thin, and translucent. If you discover your plants are nearly dead from feeding, you may need to get them out to the release site before waiting for the new adults. We'll discuss that further in a release video. Usually, if you've gotten your plants potted early and they are tall and bushy enough when you get your beetles, the larvae will just disappear into the top 2 inches of the soil to pupate after a couple of weeks, and the plant will keep growing, ready for the new adults to emerge. Once you see a net filling up with beetles like those in the lower right photo, though, it's time to get them out to your release site or call the coordinator to help with the release if that's the plan. You'll want this to happen quickly because the beetles would be running out of food and ready to eat the purple loosestrife that you want to control. Since one video isn't likely to answer all of your questions, you can send questions to dnrasinfo@wisconsin.gov or call 608-266-0061. If you're in a county with an AIS coordinator, they are very likely to be able to answer your questions and even help you get started. Visit the DNR website and search for AIS contacts to find the page that will give you all of their contact information. The program also has its own webpage on the DNR site, Purple Loosestrife Biocontrol and You. There you can find a full guide to the program as well as a mini guide, along with the Purple Loosestrife fact sheet for ID and the application and reporting data sheets that you will need to participate. This and additional videos will be posted on the UW-Madison Division of Extension YouTube page. Last, I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this video. Photos, videos, and graphics were provided by all of these folks over several years, and their help, not just with this production, but with their efforts to manage purple loosestrife in Wisconsin, are appreciated more than you can know. Thank you.